So, hi everybody and welcome back. This is Unreal Engine 5 tutorial series for absolute beginners. This is video 124 and in this video we continue with collision. In this video we want to talk more about the settings in the project settings, which is here when I go on edit on project settings, and here when we go here to the collision, and we want to try to understand this kind of stuff. What we see here, we can expand this a little bit more in detail. But before we go there, let's see what we did in the last video. I said we have to check that another object must have collision, and if it has collisions, it can respond to other objects. What means this again? For example, if I have here my character, and my character can only respond, for example, to this stone, to this cross, to this tree, or to the landscape, the bottom, only if they have also collisions. And very important the very important thing is, if you have, for example, a collision here on my static mesh here, which is a stone, and you set the static mesh, for example, let me open this one up to show what I mean fast. You can open up this static mesh and then you can check here this collisions. Yes, it is enabled. I can see it. And if you check here, for example, show and then show all things, and you can also see it here if it says you can remove a collision, which means you can have something enabled here. And of course, you must check what collision you have enabled, and where we can check this again. It was, let me get this one. It was here in the detailed setting. If you write col, it jumps to the collision section. Here is the collision section, which we are interested in. And then we can set some collisions here. For example, we discussed a little bit about two presets, which is one is the collision preset, which means this one will block all. Interesting. And then we have here the project default, which is more the collision itself, which means in this case use the default settings, in this case simple, and I added, we have it. So the problem was this one here, what it means, this collision preset. And we want to talk about this collision preset here. It says here block all. We go back to our character. So I have enabled block all, but this preset is not blocking all. And why not? The reason for that is a collision works only together with another object. So with other words, you can't say I will block all and, for example, my character says, no, I will overlap all. So these are not working together, but collision works only towards another object, which means now we have to understand how this kind of relationship works. For example, I need to set up block all towards a character. For example, in this case, we have set it to pawn. Then I must block all towards a landscape, and we have to check now what is set there and check to this other things what we want to check. So what I mean with that in short is you can't use one collision and define it in one place and say this collision I set block all would automatically block all. That's not working. Collision works only with two objects, all time with two objects, and then you compare their settings. Here you have setting block all, and here you must set also block all, and then you must also perhaps specify what you are. And what you are is this object type which we want talk here in a moment. So let's get a little bit deeper in it. Of course, there is a documentation page which I will link here in the description. Here in this collision overview, we have all this kind of stuff explained and describe how this works. And important is here, you will see it will say that it can't work alone. It needs another object to set up. And then it will show all that what I'm going to try to tell you as well. But this one is more accurate, descriptive, and with examples as well. I will link this in the description. So let's go into it and try to understand how we set this up. And to do so, we go again to edit, to project settings, here in collisions. And here in collisions, you can dock this window here on top. Then you can switch here with this here on top. And here I have this collision settings. Then here in this window, you go down to collisions, and then you have in collisions this okay, what's going on? You see, yes, you click here collisions, and then you have here this options here, object channel, trace channel, and preset. And we try to understand what happens, how this object, for example, my character, can respond to this stone. And I added in my last video as collision to it, which says block all, but this can't block the static my character right now, because my character must say, yes, I will block your setting, which means, for example, this is setting to what? For example, static mesh or something like that, and then it will block. But let's go again, check this collision presets, and we don't need all time to open up, for example, the static mesh here. You can also go click this object here, then go here right side to the details panel, and right here in general, for example, collisions, or you can jump to the physics section, because this collisions is in the physics sections as well. So there are two places, but if you go here with call, it will jump to collision section, and you can see what the collision is set to here. So let's go here a little bit through, not all, only the important parts, which is, first of all, this one says I will generate no overlap events, which means if you generate overlap this collision, I will do nothing. So then can character step up on it? That's not very important for us right now. And then here collision preset, it's default. And this default here, I tried to show you before. You have to open up this one to see what the default is. And here write collision in details, call. And the default of this collision is set block to all. And it says here also complete that we set here ourselves. But default is here block to all. And when we expand now this one, we have only watched this value here, which says we have block to all, but now we can expand this one here. And when we expand this, we see here different kind of things, different options, right? And the first says here collision enabled, and this one we will talk in a moment, how the collision reacts to other ones, but let's go on. And important is here this one here, the object type. And this one says by default I'm a world static. And that's very important here, because this one, when we talk about this stone now here, its default setting, it says I'm a world static type. And type means just, you can say identify this mesh as a world static, which means this one says here, when we have these two objects here, this says I'm a world static. My character on the other side says I'm not a world static, I'm a pawn. How we can check this? Here again, I click my character, I go to details panel, I go here, right here, collision again in general, and it jumps here to the collision. And when we go to collision preset, it says here character mesh. Actually, here this preset says character mesh, but here important, this type here is important, the object type. It says I'm a pawn, I will react if you react to pawn. So which means that if these two should react together, you must set this object type here to static mesh, reacts to pawn, and this pawn must react to the static mesh, and then they can interact together. For example, let's say here what we have here. I go here again to collision. I see it says preset. We will see what this preset is in a moment, but let's talk about this type, which is more important, because this type says I'm a pawn, and my pawn sets and you are a static mesh, and I react to a static mesh. And when we go here down, this list here, which is grayed out here in this case, says I have a default setting of static mesh. It says here is a list and tries to find the static mesh object here, which means I can identify this stone here if I have here a static mesh. And what was it again? What was the what was here? It says here world static, not static mesh. Sorry, it says here object type world static. So we have to find the right world static. So the pawn says I'm a pawn. Again, I'm a pawn, and I react to world static, which is here, and I set it by default to block. So this one is by default block, which means this character will block this one only if this one sets also block to pawn. So how we can check now this one? We go here in. Again, I'm here in collision. This time I clicked here this stone here, and I'm here in collision. Let's make the same game like before. We go here to this, where is that? I can't see that. I'm blind all the time when I do this. Collision presets. Let me see here again. Collision presets. Yes, I can open this one. Why I can't open this one here? Default. Okay, because this one is set to default, and default we have. Okay, now I see. The problem here by default is we can't expand here the view like here, because this one is, for example, let me click this character here. This preset is to set to character mesh, and we can watch this preset. And here when I click my static mesh, you can see this, there is no default opening. We have to check actually what the default is. That's a little bit annoying, because really then you have to go to your character mesh again, and now you can check here what the default is, and then you can see the preset is to block all, and then you have to see this one here. This one is the setting, and it is annoying because normally you want that this one should also expand it here and see all the presettings. And of course you can set it to something special here, and we will learn this in a moment. But let's learn first the default setting to understand, because yes, it can cause problems like it did here to me, that I can't expand this one. So you have to go then really, if it says here default, to the static mesh, open it up, go to this collision section, and then you see here this collision preset is here set to block all. And block all means this one and here. Now important. This one, again, because this was a little bit complicated, but whatever. Let's see again. So this one says what type I am. We have to check the type. Where I can see this, it says here. This object type, I am a world static, and I will react to a pawn. I said this and this one must set to each other. The pawn has set here in his setting, I react to world static with a block. And this one here must set now also as a world static that I react to a pawn with a block. So that must be set that they can block each other. So let's go here to the static and check if this world static itself, this is this one here, reacts to a pawn. This is this one here. Here we have this section pawn, and it say me as a world static will react to a pawn with a block. You can read it this way. So it will say block, but this one works only if the pawn itself says the same. For example, here my character, we go here to its setting presets. It says me, I'm a pawn. Here my object type is I'm a pawn, and I react, for example, to a world static. If we find this here, it says here world static. I react to a world static with a block. So he says I will block a world static. The world static says I will block a pawn, and now because of this one they will block each other. So when I play this one here, now I block. this. And very important here is, this works not if only one says I block. What I mean with that is, let's say this one here says, like before, we have to go to the collision preset. In this case, it says default. That's a little bit complicated. We have to open up this one and watch the default here. And it says here, for example, let's say I make here block overlap all. I make now overlap all by default. I change now the setting to collision. Where is that? Here, to overlap all. Here is it, the collision preset. It says I'm a world static, but I will, and now we read all the other objects. I will overlap all the other objects. We are interested only in the pawn right now because my character is a pawn, and it says now I will overlap it. I will not block it. And here, when I make this one, you can see the problem is now here. My character says I will block all the world static. Here I go here to the details panel. I say I will block all the world static if I find one. This one is a world static. The problem is this world static says I will overlap all, and they are not matching to each other. And if they are not matching to each other, there is a priority list, which means they will only block each other if they set both to block. But if they are not set to each other block, for example overlap, then the priority list say this will be not blocking, even if the character says I block all world statics, because this character says I have set world static, which is this object here, in my setting. Let me show you this one. Why I can click here this one. Here in my setting, I will block it. But this one is not working now. Let's test it. Perhaps I talk crap. And now I walk in and I can walk through. And the reason for that is, like I said, the problem is this character said, yes, you are a world static. And in my setting says, I will block it. But the world static itself says, wait a minute, I don't block a character because my default setting says I should overlap you. And we can see it here. So all time when we read something like that, go to the type, and this type says I'm a world static, and in our character says his type is, for example, we can see it here, his type is a pawn, and this two, pawn and world static, must match each other with block. And then I said there is a priority list, right? If they are not the same, for example, now this says I block, but the other says no, I don't block, I overlap. And then the priority list comes in account, which means, let me show this one in the documentation, which means here, you can read this again, what I explained all in this priority list, which means in a simple way that you can see we have here ignore, overlap, block. And if you have overlap or ignore, they will be the priority list goes so first, most important is ignore. That means if you have set ignore and here, for example, block on the other side, it will ignore this block at all and it will use ignore. If you set overlap, this is the second priority, and you have set to block, it will use the overlap and it will ignore your block. And the third priority is the last one, is the block, which means if you want block something, you have both set to block. That's so the idea here. And if they are not set both to block, for example, one is set to block and the other is set to overlap, then this one will get priority. But how this works in detail, for example, now with overlap events, that we will see. But this is the idea. So this is the background idea which you really have to understand is, first of all, if click your object, here in my case this object is a character, then go your collision, check here this object type, and this object type says now right now I'm a pawn, and then this pawn has, for example, in this case, presets. We will talk about presets in a moment in the object settings, in the project settings, not object settings, sorry. And this preset says, I react to all this kind around me. For example, this world static is this thing here. Perhaps this one has also, this cross is perhaps also a world static. Perhaps this tree is a world static, who knows? And then I can react to this one if I set them properly. And it says here, if you tree a world static, I will block you. If you cross a world static, I will block you. At least I will try to block you. Why I say I try to block you? Because the other one must react to its settings too, right? And all time think about this. First, check this object type. I'm a pawn. Then I will react to the other object. For example, if the other object is world static, I will try, not I will block, I will try to block it only if the other object, let's click here, for example, this cross here. If you are set, for example, block pawn 2, for example, this stone which we set up, when I go here to the collision, okay, that's a little bit hard because it's not directly showing it. We have really open it up and go in and check the defaults. And here in defaults, we see this preset here and all this kind of stuff. But in general, you would check first what this type is. In this case, I go in and say, okay, this one is type world static, this object here, and it sets to pawn overlap. Oh, they will overlap because the priority list, this both here, will not block each other. And if I want to make them block each other, okay, I go to this priority list and I want that you block the pawn. I have to change this one to block, and then I have to check this, that my pawn, which is pawn set the world static, which is this stone here, you have to check that this one is block as well, and that will block. And here fast this example with this cross, what happens now? I say check this cross here. When I watch this one here, I have the problem again. Oh, the preset says here default. So what I have to do with this cross, you go here, open up this cross. In this case, it's this one. Let's check this fast for test purposes. Now we go here on the details panel to collision. All right. And in collision, it says by default block all. And now we can expand this reaction thing, and it says by default I'm a world static, right? This cross is a world static, and it says world I will block a pawn. That's good because I want that my pawn blocks this one, so it will react to a pawn with a block. But careful, here is one more tricky thing which you have to consider. Make not this mistake, right? I watch this cross and it's not blocking. So this is a tricky question. Can you think about what I talked so far, why this is not blocking? If you can, it's good. If not, no problem. That's why we learn it and you have to read it. Here, this one is tricky because you have to think about the video one before. You have to check first if this has a collision enabled. For example, this one here has perhaps not even a collision to react to. So with other words, doesn't matter what you have set up here. If there is no collision enabled, and that's why the video before was very important, all this thing what I have explained to you here was for nothing. Because it can react, it can't react. Only with a collision, it can use all this kind of stuff here. All right, which means if I want to make this to work, I say, okay, if I use the simplified collision, you see that's not really good and accurate. Perhaps we should not use this one in this case. Let's click here, remove, and let's go here. Perhaps this one here, let's say this, apply. Is this better? Yes, that's a little bit better. Let's use this one this time. Must be not very accurate, and that's okay. And now I have this enabled, and now save this. Now I have a collision, and this collision I have also to set this one here. Where is that? Not this one. Here. this one, collision complexity. It's by default. Default means this one here. And now I can see that this one is working. I'm blocking now. Now all the presets what I talked so far is working. And what was it again? When we expand this, it says I'm a world static. This object here, I'm a world static. And I will respond to a pawn with blocking. And if the pawn is also blocking, we will block each other. So we go to the character again fast. I click my character here. I go to the details panel, collision, and my character says I'm a pawn. And I react to a world static with a blocking. Yes, so we are matching, block, block, perfect. We will block to each other. So if you understand this one and read the documentation a little bit more, you will understand this more in detail. But here's one more thing we have to talk before I stop. And this is this project setting. And I think this video could be too long because now we will create this and set this up. Perhaps I make another video in the next video to set this up and show you this properly. And yeah, I make this so, and I stop here. If you have any questions or any complaints like all time, or any tips and tricks, that's very interesting too for me, write it in the comments, and I will link this documentation page again in the description, so you can read this one, how this priority list works. And they make here also examples and how we set up this project settings here, how we set up our own presets and our own object channels we make in the next video, because this is also very important. And then you can prove that you really understand this concept of how this works together. So with that said, see you in the next. Bye and good luck.